Welcome to American Legacy Stories, where we journey back to the heart of the 20th century to uncover the quiet, extraordinary tales of the women who shaped our nation. These are the stories of courage forged in kitchens and factories, of resilience whispered in lullabies and letters, celebrating the generation of mothers and daughters who held America together with unwavering strength. The cold was a thief. It crept under the door jambs of the small clapboard house on Elm Street, a phantom presence that stole the warmth from the floorboards and left a ghostly filigree of ice on the inside of the windowpanes. It was the kind of deep, bone-aching cold that February in Ohio saved for its cruelest moments, a cold that made the very timbers of the house groan in protest. But in the kitchen, a fragile pocket of warmth was beginning to bloom. Agnes Miller stood before the hulking black cast-iron stove, its belly glowing with a carefully banked fire. The air smelled of wood smoke, old iron, and something else, a faint, almost sacred sweetness. On the worn linoleum of the countertop sat a small, dented tin canister, its painted blue flowers chipped and faded from years of use. Beside it, a precious mound of white crystals sat on a piece of wax paper, shimmering in the thin morning light. It was the last of the sugar. Not just the last of the ration for the month, but the last of the secret, hoarded spoonfuls she had saved for months, a tiny rebellion against the relentless scarcity of 1943. Every granule was a memory, a ghost of a time before. A spoonful for Daniel's coffee on a Sunday morning, the steam rising to catch the light as he read the paper. A pinch to sweeten the wild blackberries the children had picked last summer, their fingers and mouths stained a delightful purple. Now it was a treasure, more precious than any jewel, and she was about to spend it all in one glorious, defiant act of love. Her children, 7-year-old Michael and 5-year-old Sarah, were huddled by the stove, their small bodies wrapped in patched wool sweaters, their faces pale in the winter light. They watched her with the solemn, wide-eyed intensity that children reserve for moments of true magic. They understood, in the way that children of wartime understood things beyond their years, the magnitude of this gesture. A cake was not just a cake. It was a festival, a miracle, a sweet, crumbly promise that even in a world of clipped ration books and somber newsreels, there was still room for joy. Agnes's hands, chapped and reddened from lye soap and cold water, moved with the steady, practiced grace of a woman who had measured out her life in cups of flour and teaspoons of vanilla. She sifted the flour, a fine white dust clouding the air. She creamed the lard with the precious sugar, her wooden spoon making a soft, rhythmic scraping sound against the sides of the heavy ceramic bowl. There were no eggs to be had, not for any price, but she had a wartime recipe from a magazine that called for vinegar and baking soda to give the batter its lift. A victory cake, they called it. It felt right. Every motion was deliberate, a prayer against the gnawing anxiety that lived coiled in the pit of her stomach. The anxiety had a name, Daniel, her Daniel. His face, handsome and smiling in the photograph on the mantelpiece, was a constant, aching presence. He was somewhere in the Pacific, a place she could only imagine from the crackling reports of Edward R. Murrow on the radio, a sweltering, impossible landscape of jungles and islands with names she couldn't pronounce. Every letter from him, thin and translucent on its V-mail form, was a reprieve, a stay of execution against her darkest fears. The last one had arrived 2 weeks ago, full of his usual steady optimism, but she could read the exhaustion between the lines, the things he couldn't say written in the very slant of his handwriting. "Is it almost ready, Mama?" Sarah's voice was a small, hopeful whisper. Agnes looked down at her daughter's upturned face, at the smattering of freckles across her nose that were a perfect echo of Daniel S. She forced a smile, a real one, pushing the fear back down into its dark corner. "Almost, little bird, we have to be patient. Good things take time." She poured the batter into the greased and floured pan, scraping every last drop from the bowl with a spatula. As she slid it into the oven, the warmth washed over her face, a fleeting comfort against the persistent chill. She closed the heavy oven door with a soft click, a sound of finality. The treasure was spent. For a moment, a wave of panic washed over her. What if something happened? What if there was an emergency, a sickness that required a spoonful of sugar for medicine? What if the news from the front was bad and she had wasted this last comfort on a simple cake? But then she looked at her children, their eyes shining with an uncomplicated, perfect hope, and she knew she had done the right thing. This cake was not a waste, it was a weapon. It was a shield against the fear, a declaration that their small family in their small house on a quiet street in a world gone mad was still whole. It was a taste of a life they had known before and a promise of a life they would one day have again, a life where sugar wasn't counted by the grain and fathers came home from the war. She just had to believe it. Standing there in the fragile warmth of her kitchen, with the scent of vanilla beginning to fill the air, she held onto that belief as if it were the last, most precious ration of all. The memory of Daniel was woven into the very fabric of the house. It lived in the slight indentation on his side of the mattress, in the worn copy of For Whom the Bell Tolls on the nightstand, in the scent of old spice that still clung faintly to his wool coat in the hall closet. Before the war, their life had felt as simple and sturdy as the oak tree in their backyard. He was a carpenter, his hands large and calloused but capable of such gentleness, whether he was planing a piece of wood until it was smooth as silk or stroking Sarah's hair. Agnes had been a homemaker, her world defined by the rhythms of the seasons, canning in the summer, quilting in the winter, the daily rituals of creating a warm and loving home. Their life was not one of wealth but of richness, a tapestry of small, shared joys. He had a laugh that started deep in his chest and made the windows rattle, a laugh she hadn't heard in 18 months. The day he left was seared into her mind, a series of stark, painful snapshots. The train station, loud with the hiss of steam and the forced gaiety of a brass band playing a patriotic march. The rough feel of his uniform against her cheek as she clung to him, trying to memorize the solid, living warmth of him. The look in his eyes, a mixture of fear, duty, and a desperate love for her and the children. He had pressed something small and hard into her palm. "So you don't forget me," he'd whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. When she opened her hand, a small wooden bluebird lay nestled in her palm. He had carved it himself from a scrap of maple, its lines simple and perfect, its surface sanded to a soft, warm glow. It was a piece of him, a tangible piece of the steady, creative man she loved. That bluebird now sat on the kitchen windowsill, its silent, unblinking gaze a constant witness to her days. It was the first thing she saw in the morning and the last thing she looked at before turning off the light at night. It was her talisman, a fragile symbol of hope against a sea of uncertainty. The world had shrunk after he left, becoming a place of boundaries and limitations defined by the ration book. Red stamps for meat and butter, blue stamps for processed foods. Gasoline was for doctors and essential workers. Her world became a careful calculation of ounces and points, a constant, low-grade struggle to make something from almost nothing. The victory garden they had planted together in the spring before he shipped out became her salvation. The neat rows of beans, carrots, and tomatoes were a patch of control in a world that had spun wildly out of it. Weeding and watering became a form of prayer, her hands in the soil a connection to something real and life-giving. Her neighbors, the Hendersons on one side and the sharp-tongued but kind-hearted widow Mrs. Gable on the other, were in the same boat. They traded onions for potatoes, shared snippets of news from their own sons and husbands overseas, and complained in hushed tones about the price of coffee on the black market. "Heard from your Daniel?" Mrs. Gable would ask, her voice carrying easily over the low hedge that separated their yards as she hung her laundry. "A letter last week," Agnes would reply, not elaborating. The contents of the letters were private, sacred texts to be read and reread until the flimsy paper threatened to disintegrate. My boy, Frank, is in Italy now. Says the food is terrible, but the girls are pretty, Mrs. Gable would cackle, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It was her way of coping. Agnes knew this gruff, unsentimental chatter. Everyone had their own way. Agnes's was in the quiet, steady work of her hands, in the relentless routine of keeping her home and her children safe and fed. But the routine was becoming a strain. The small amount of money Daniel sent home from his army pay didn't stretch as far as it used to, and her own small savings were dwindling. The heels on Michael's shoes were worn through, and Sarah's coat was too short in the sleeves. The decision had been growing in her mind for weeks, a seed of necessity that was finally beginning to sprout. She had to get a job. It was a daunting prospect. She hadn't worked outside the home since she was married. But the papers were full of advertisements, desperate calls for women to fill the factory floors, to become the army of workers behind the army of soldiers. "We can do it," proclaimed the posters of a determined-looking woman in a bandana. Looking at the determined set of that woman's jaw, Agnes felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: resolve. The cake, in a way, was a farewell to her old life. It was the last grand gesture of the woman who stayed at home. Tomorrow she would put on her best dress, walk down to the recruitment office, and become someone new. The thought was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. She would do it for Michael and Sarah, and she would do it for Daniel. She would hold their world together with both hands, just as he was fighting to hold the larger world together with his. As she pulled the finished cake from the oven, its surface a perfect golden brown, the sweet scent of victory filled the small, cold kitchen. It smelled, she thought, like the future. The world outside her front door was a cacophony of new sounds and smells. The acrid tang of coal smoke from the factory chimneys hung in the air, a permanent gray haze that muted the morning sun. The shriek of whistles and the rumble of heavy trucks replaced the familiar morning chorus of birdsong and the milkman's clinking bottles. Agnes, dressed in a simple but neatly pressed dress, felt her heart pound against her ribs with a nervous rhythm that matched the clatter of the streetcar she rode towards the industrial heart of the city. The other passengers were a mix of men in overalls, too old or infirm for the draft, and women. So many women. Their faces were set with a similar determination, their hands clutching metal lunch pails, their chatter a low, constant buzz of factory gossip and domestic worries. Agnes felt a strange sense of both belonging and complete alienation. She was one of them, yet she felt like an imposter, a housewife playing dress-up in a worker's world. The amalgamated textile factory was a vast, red-brick leviathan that sprawled over several city blocks. Inside, the noise was a physical force, a deafening, relentless roar of machinery that vibrated through the soles of her shoes and seemed to settle deep in her bones. Hundreds of women sat hunched over sewing machines, their bodies swaying in unison with the rhythmic punch of the needles. A forest of white silk billowed around them, flowing from enormous spools and being expertly guided, stitched, and folded into the life-saving canopies of parachutes. A harried-looking foreman with a clipboard and a weary face barely glanced at her application before pointing her towards a vacant machine at the end of a long row. "Ever run a Singer Industrial?" he shouted over the din. Agnes shook her head, feeling a fresh wave of panic. Her little machine at home was a toy compared to this iron beast. "Betty'll show you," he yelled, gesturing to the young woman at the next station. "Don't snag the silk. It's worth more than you are." Betty looked up, her face smudged with grease but her red lipstick a slash of cheerful defiance. She couldn't have been more than 20, with bright, intelligent eyes that took in Agnes's nervous posture and prim dress in a single glance. She gave a quick, reassuring grin. "Don't mind him. He was born with a burr in his britches. Come on, sit down, I'll get you started." Betty became Agnes's guide and unexpectedly her first real friend outside of her small neighborhood circle. She was everything Agnes was not: loud, funny, and utterly unafraid to speak her mind. She explained the complex system of seams and reinforcements, showed Agnes how to thread the industrial needle without losing a finger, and taught her how to pace herself to meet the punishing daily quota. During their 15-minute lunch break, they would sit on a crate in the alley behind the factory, eating their sandwiches and sharing stories. Betty was engaged to a sailor named Jimmy, stationed at Pearl Harbor, and she spoke of him with a casual, confident love that Agnes envied. "Jimmy says he's gonna take me to California when this is all over," Betty said one afternoon, biting into an apple with a loud crunch. "Says he's never gonna look at another boat as long as he lives." "What about you and your fella? What's his name?" "Daniel," Agnes said, the name feeling soft in her mouth. "He's a carpenter. We were going to add a porch to the back of the house. He'd already drawn up the plans. He'll be back to build it," Betty said with certainty. "You gotta believe that. It's the only thing that gets you through." The work was grueling. Her back ached, her fingers were raw and calloused, and the constant noise of the factory floor left a ringing in her ears that lasted long into the night. But the weekly pay envelope was a small miracle. It meant she could buy Michael new shoes without a guilty conscience. It meant she could afford a bit of beef from Mr. Henderson's cousin who owned a farm, a clandestine, off-ration transaction that felt both thrilling and shameful. It meant a small measure of security in a world that offered none. The money, however, was only part of it. In the factory, surrounded by the shared purpose and easy camaraderie of the other women, something within Agnes began to shift. She was no longer just Daniel's wife or Michael and Sarah's mother. She was Agnes Miller, a woman who could operate a complex piece of machinery, who contributed to the war effort, who earned her own way. She discovered a competence in herself she hadn't known existed. She learned to fix the belt on her sewing machine when it slipped, to spot a flawed stitch from 10 feet away, and to hold her own in the boisterous, fast-paced world of the factory floor. Her life settled into a new, demanding rhythm. Up before dawn to get the children ready, the long streetcar ride to the factory, 8 hours of relentless, mind-numbing work, and then the journey home to cook, clean, and care for her family. Her only quiet time was late at night, after the children were asleep. She would sit at the small kitchen table, the wooden bluebird perched on the windowsill beside her, and write her letters to Daniel. She told him about the factory, about Betty, about Michael's progress in school, and Sarah's latest funny pronouncement. She censored her own exhaustion and fear, filling the pages with a determined cheerfulness she didn't always feel. His replies were her lifeline. They were often weeks or months old by the time they arrived, his words from a distant, unimaginable reality intersecting with her own. He wrote about the heat, the insects, the endless ocean, and his longing for home. He asked about the oak tree, about Mrs. Gable's cat, about the taste of her apple pie. These small, specific questions were his way of holding on, of anchoring himself to the world he had left behind. One evening, a letter arrived that was different. The handwriting was messier, the lines hurried. He wrote about a skirmish, a friend who had been injured. For the first time, the brutal reality of his situation bled through the carefully constructed barrier of his optimism. He wrote, "Sometimes at night I close my eyes and I try to imagine the kitchen. I can smell the wood smoke from the stove and the coffee you used to make. I can see the bluebird on the sill. Hold on to it for me, Aggie." Hold on to everything? Agnes clutched the thin paper, her knuckles white. The bluebird on the windowsill seemed to mock her with its silent, inanimate hope. She felt a cold dread seep into the room, a fear more profound than any she had yet allowed herself to feel. Holding on to things was her specialty. It was what she did every single day. But what if the things she was holding onto were just ghosts? What if the man who wrote this letter was already a memory, and she was just waiting for the official, devastating news to arrive? She stood up and walked to the stove, her moving NTS stiff. She ran a hand over its cold, iron surface. The cake she had baked in a moment of defiant hope now seemed like a foolish, naive gesture. Victory felt a very long way off. She picked up the little wooden bird, its smooth, cool surface a poor substitute for her husband's hand. She held it tight, the edges digging into her palm, and whispered into the silent, lonely kitchen, "I'm holding on, Daniel. I'm holding on." The small victories were what kept her afloat. They were tiny islands of light in a sea of routine and worry, a successful patch on a pair of Michael's trousers that was nearly invisible. A row of carrots from the Victory Garden that came up straight and sweet. The rare, blissful moment when a Benny Goodman tune would play on the radio just as she was washing the supper dishes, and she would find herself humming along, her spirits lifted by the swinging rhythm. Her friendship with Betty deepened into a true sisterhood. They covered for each other when the foreman was in a foul mood, shared gossip and chocolate from their ration books, and offered a shoulder to lean on when the news from the front was particularly grim. One sweltering afternoon in July, the factory air thick with humidity and the smell of machine oil, the monotony was shattered. A new directive had come down from the management. A rush order for a new type of parachute, a larger, more complex design for supply drops, had to be completed in record time. The quotas were doubled. The women were told they would have to work mandatory overtime, 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week until the order was filled. A low, angry murmur rippled through the factory floor. It wasn't just the exhaustion, it was the principle. They were already working to the bone for wages that barely kept their families fed. "They can't do that," Betty fumed during their break, her face flushed with indignation. "It's not right. Our union agreement specifies an 8-hour day. There's a war on." Betty, another woman, a weary mother of 4 named Mary, sighed. "What choice do we have?" "We always have a choice," Betty shot back, her eyes flashing. Agnes remained quiet. The thought of 2 more hours away from her children each day made her feel sick. Michael was already struggling with his reading, and she was the only one who had the patience to help him. Sarah had been having nightmares, waking up crying for a father she was beginning to forget. But the extra money from the overtime would mean a new winter coat for her, a real one from the department store, not a hand-me-down. It was a constant, exhausting calculus of needs and sacrifices. The next day, the tension in the factory was palpable. The foreman patrolled the aisles like a hawk, his gaze sharp, daring anyone to slow down. Late in the afternoon, Agnes saw him stop at Betty's station. He was holding up a finished parachute, pointing angrily at a section of the canopy. Agnes couldn't hear his words over the roar of the machines, but she could see the fury in his face and the defiant set of Betty's jaw. He threw the parachute onto a discard pile and scribbled something on his clipboard. Betty's face went pale. When the 5 o'clock whistle blew, signaling the start of the mandatory overtime, Betty began packing up her things. "What happened?" Agnes asked, her stomach twisting into a knot. "He said I sabotaged the chute," Betty said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "He said a seam was puckered. It wasn't. He's making an example of me because I spoke up about the overtime." "I'm fired, Agnes." The word hung in the air, ugly and final. For a woman in 1943, being fired from a war factory wasn't just a loss of income. It was a black mark, a stain of being unpatriotic. Agnes looked at her friend's stricken face and then at the faces of the other women nearby, who quickly looked away, their expressions a mixture of pity and fear. They didn't want to get involved. They had their own families, their own worries. And in that moment, Agnes felt the quiet, timid woman she used to be recede, replaced by a steelier, unfamiliar version of herself. This wasn't right. Betty was the best seamstress in their section. It was a blatant injustice, a petty act of tyranny by a small man with a little bit of power. "Wait here," Agnes said, her voice low but firm. Before she could lose her nerve, she walked over to the discard pile and picked up the parachute. She ran her fingers over the seam in question. It was perfect. She had seen Betty sew it herself, her movements swift and sure. Agnes carried the heavy silk over to the foreman's desk. He looked up, his face a mask of annoyance. "What do you want, Miller? Get back to your machine." "This seam is perfect," Agnes said, her voice surprisingly steady. She spread the fabric across his desk. "There's nothing wrong with it, you know it and I know it." The foreman's face darkened. "Are you calling me a liar?" he growled, standing up to loom over her. Agnes's heart was hammering against her ribs, but she held his gaze. She thought of Daniel in a jungle halfway across the world, fighting for something he believed in. She thought of her children at home, depending on her to not only provide for them, but to teach them the difference between right and wrong. This was her jungle. This was her fight. "I'm saying you made a mistake," she said, choosing her words carefully. "And you're about to lose your best worker because of it. We all want to get this order done. We all want to help our boys. But we can't do it if you treat us like this. We're not machines, Mr. Harrison, we're people." A silence fell over the immediate area. The hum of the distant machines seemed to fade. Mr. Harrison stared at her, his jaw working. Agnes could feel the eyes of the other women on her back. She was terrified. But as she stood there, defending her friend, she felt a profound sense of clarity. For 18 months, her life had been defined by waiting, by powerlessness. She waited for letters, waited for news, waited for the war to end. But here, in this small, personal battle, she was not powerless. She had a voice. To her astonishment, the foreman's gaze dropped. He looked at the seam, then back at her face. He let out a long, weary sigh and ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Fine," he grumbled, not looking at Betty. "It must have been the light. Get back to work." "All of you?" He turned and walked away. A collective, quiet sigh of relief went through the women. Betty rushed over to Agnes, her eyes wide. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Agnes replied, a small, triumphant smile touching her lips as she walked back to her station. "We've got a quota to meet." That night, as she helped Michael with his reading, his small finger tracing the words on the page, she felt a change in herself. The anxious knot in her stomach had loosened, replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. She had faced down a bully not with fists or fury, but with the simple, unshakable power of the truth. She was stronger than she knew. As she tucked Sarah into bed, the little girl wrapped her arms around Agnes's neck. "You're the best mama in the whole world," she murmured sleepily. Agnes held her close, breathing in the sweet, innocent scent of her daughter. In that moment, she felt a fierce, protective love that was as real and powerful as any army. She was a parachute stitcher, a mother, a wife, a friend. She was the keeper of the home front, and she would not let them fall. The autumn of 1944 was a season of nervous hope. The news from Europe was good. Paris had been liberated, and the Allied armies were pushing towards Germany. But in the Pacific, the fighting was growing more ferocious. The names of the islands more terrifying: Peleliu, Leyte Gulf. Daniel's letters were infrequent now, and the brief, heavily censored V-mail forms spoke of endless rain, mud, and a weariness that seeped through the ink. The bluebird on the windowsill seemed to have grown heavier, its cheerful posture a stark contrast to the weight of dread that settled on Agnes's heart. She lived in a state of suspended animation, her emotions caught between the patriotic optimism of the radio broadcasts and the cold, private fear that a single telegram could shatter her world. The crisis, when it came, had nothing to do with the war overseas, but with the fragile peace of her own home. It started with a cough, a dry, hacking cough that seized Michael in the middle of the night and left him breathless and pale. At first, Agnes treated it with the usual remedies: a steam kettle in his room, a mustard plaster on his chest, honey and lemon for his raw throat. But the cough persisted, settling deep in his small chest, accompanied by a fever that rose and fell like a relentless tide. Dr. Adams, his face grim and tired from too many house calls, finally gave her the diagnosis she had been dreading. Pneumonia. In a time before penicillin was widely available to civilians, it was a word that carried the weight of a death sentence. "We have to get the fever down," Dr. Adams said, packing his worn leather bag. "Keep him warm, give him fluids, and pray. It's the best we can do." The world shrank to the four walls of Michael's small bedroom. Agnes sat by his bedside, bathing his forehead with cool cloths, trying to coax spoonfuls of broth between his cracked lips. He was delirious at times, murmuring about baseball and his father, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Sarah, frightened and confused, was sent to stay with Mrs. Gable, who, for all her gruffness, took the little girl in without a moment's hesitation, baking her cookies and letting her play with her collection of porcelain cats. The factory, the quotas, the war, it all faded into an insignificant background hum. The only thing that mattered was the ragged sound of her son's breathing, days blurred into a sleepless, anxious haze. Agnes felt herself fraying at the edges, her own exhaustion a distant, secondary concern. One afternoon, as Michael slept fitfully, she went into the kitchen to make herself a cup of tea. Her eyes fell on the sugar tin, the one she had emptied for the victory cake what felt like a lifetime ago. It now held her small collection of buttons. Beside it, on the windowsill, the wooden bluebird kept its silent vigil. She picked it up, its familiar shape a small comfort in her hand. She thought of Daniel's letter, hold onto everything. She was trying. Oh God, she was trying so hard, but she could feel her son slipping away from her. A wave of despair so profound, it buckled her knees, washed over her. She leaned against the counter, the bird pressed to her cheek, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry silent, racking sobs that shook her entire body. Just then, a knock came at the back door. It was Betty, her face etched with concern. She had come straight from the factory, still in her work clothes. "I came to check on you," she said softly, stepping into the kitchen. "Mary told me Michael was sick." She took in Agnes's tear-streaked face, the exhaustion in her eyes, and immediately took charge. "You need to rest," she said, her voice firm. "Go lie down for an hour. I'll sit with him. I mean it, Agnes." Go. The simple act of kindness was so overwhelming that Agnes could only nod, a fresh wave of tears blurring her vision. She went into her own room and collapsed onto the bed, falling into a deep, dreamless sleep for the first time in days. When she awoke, the late afternoon sun was slanting through the window and the house was quiet. She walked back into Michael's room. Betty was sitting in the chair by the bed, reading a story aloud from one of his books in a low, soothing voice. Michael's eyes were open, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were clear. The fever had broken. He was weak, but he was lucid. He managed a small, faint smile when he saw her. "Mama," he whispered. The relief that flooded through Agnes was so immense, so powerful, it felt like a physical rebirth. She knelt by his bed and took his small, cool hand in hers, pressing it to her lips. He was going to be all right. He was going to live. A week later, Michael was out of bed, pale and thin, but on the mend. Agnes was back at the factory, the familiar roar of the machines a welcome, normal sound. She felt as though she had returned from a long and perilous journey. She had faced her deepest fear and come through the other side, not alone, but supported by the unexpected strength and kindness of a friend. Her life was no longer a solitary act of endurance. It was part of a larger web of connection, a community of women holding each other up, sharing the burdens of a world at war. That November, as the first snows began to fall, another piece of news arrived, not by telegram, but on the radio. General MacArthur had fulfilled his promise to return to the Philippines. The announcer read a long list of the army units involved in the brutal island-hopping campaign. Agnes listened, her heart frozen, until she heard it. The 148th Infantry Regiment, Daniel's regiment. They were in the thick of it. The news, which should have been a sign of impending victory, filled her with a new and specific terror. She could picture it now, the mud, the rain, the jungle. She could picture him. She closed her eyes and gripped the edge of the kitchen table, her knuckles turning white. She had saved her son. Now all she could do was pray that someone, somewhere, was watching over her husband, keeping him safe until he, too, could come home. The waiting, she realized, was the hardest battle of all. The end of the war did not arrive with a single, triumphant bang, but as a series of tremors that shook the world. VE Day in May of 1945 brought dancing in the streets and jubilant headlines, but for Agnes, it was a hollow celebration. The war in the Pacific raged on, a brutal, bloody endgame. Then came August, and with it, two terrifying new words that crackled over the radio: Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A new kind of fear gripped the nation, a sense of awe and horror at the destructive power that had been unleashed. A week later, it was over. Japan had surrendered. The war was finally, truly over. The news spread through the factory like wildfire. The foreman blew the main whistle, its shriek signaling not the end of a shift but the end of an era. The machines ground to a halt and a strange, unaccustomed silence descended. And then the noise erupted anew, not the roar of industry but the sound of pure, unadulterated human joy. Women wept, laughed, and hugged each other, their faces streaked with grease and tears. Betty grabbed Agnes and they danced a clumsy, exuberant jig in the aisle, laughing until they couldn't breathe. The world felt new, reborn, washed clean of a long and terrible shadow. But beneath the joy, a new anxiety began to grow. The waiting changed. It was no longer a question of if the men would come home, but when. The slow, agonizing process of demobilization began. Every day, the newspapers printed lists of units whose troop ships had departed, and every day Agnes scanned the columns, searching for the 148th Infantry. Her letters to Daniel went unanswered, lost in the vast, chaotic machinery of a military in transition. Weeks turned into months. Men began to appear back on Elm Street, their uniforms looking baggy on their thinner frames, their eyes holding a distant, haunted look. Each homecoming was a celebration for one family and a fresh pang of longing for Agnes. "Don't you worry, Aggie," Mrs. Gable told her over the hedge one crisp autumn afternoon. "The paperwork is just slow. My Frank says the army couldn't organize a 2-car funeral. Daniel will be home before you know it." Agnes clung to that hope. She kept the house immaculate, planted late-season chrysanthemums in the flower boxes, and saved her meat and sugar rations for a homecoming feast. She imagined the moment over and over, the sound of his footsteps on the porch, the turn of the doorknob, the look on his face when he saw her and the children. He arrived on a gray Tuesday in November with no warning. Agnes was in the kitchen peeling potatoes for supper when the back door opened. She turned, expecting to see Michael coming in from school, but it was Daniel. He was impossibly thin, his skin sallow and stretched tight over his cheekbones. His uniform hung on him like a shroud, but it was his eyes that stopped her heart. The easy, laughing light she remembered was gone, replaced by a flat, exhausted emptiness. He looked like a stranger wearing her husband's face. She dropped the peeler, which clattered into the sink. For a moment, they just stared at each other across the small room. Then he gave her a small, broken smile. "Hi, Aggie," he whispered, his voice raspy. And then she was moving, crossing the kitchen in 2 steps, her arms wrapping around his fragile frame. She could feel every bone in his back. He felt like he would break. He buried his face in her hair, and she felt a shudder run through him, a single, dry sob he couldn't hold back. The children, hearing the commotion, ran into the kitchen. They stopped short, staring at the tall, gaunt stranger hugging their mother. Sarah hid behind Agnes's legs, peering out with wide, uncertain eyes. Michael just stood there, his face a mask of confusion. This was not the hero father from the photograph on the mantel. The homecoming she had dreamed of was nothing like the reality. Daniel was quiet, withdrawn. He barely ate, and at night he thrashed in his sleep, crying out in a language she didn't understand. The loud, booming laugh that used to fill the house was silent. He spent hours just sitting in the living room, staring out the window, his hands limp in his lap. He couldn't work. The smell of sawdust and the sound of a hammer, things that had once defined him, now made him flinch. He was a ghost in his own home, haunted by memories he could not or would not share. Agnes's strength was tested in a way it never had been during the war. This was a new kind of battle, a fight to reclaim the man she loved from the silent, invisible prison of his own mind. Her friends and neighbors didn't understand. They saw a soldier who had come home in one piece and couldn't comprehend the wounds that didn't bleed. "He'll snap out of it," they'd say with cheerful, unhelpful optimism. But Agnes knew it wasn't that simple. She had to be patient, to give him space, to love him without expectation. Her work at the factory had ended. The men had come home and the women were expected to return to their kitchens. But the lessons she had learned there, the resilience and competence she had discovered in herself, now became her most vital too. She managed the finances, made the decisions, and held the family together with a quiet, unwavering strength. Her legacy was not going to be a grand, heroic tale. It was going to be built in the small, daily acts of love and endurance. It was in the way she gently coaxed Daniel to eat, the way she reassured the children that their father still loved them, the way she created a sanctuary of peace and order in their home, a safe harbor where his battered soul could begin to heal. It was a slow, painful, and often thankless task, but she did it without complaint. She was holding on just as she had promised. She was holding on for all of them. The years that followed were a quiet, patient reconstruction, not of a nation, but of a man and a family. The late 1940s gave way to the booming prosperity of the 1950s. The world outside their small house on Elm Street was changing at a dizzying pace. New cars with chrome fins appeared on the streets, televisions began to flicker in living room windows, and the threat of a new kind of war, a cold one, hummed beneath the surface of suburban life. But inside the Miller home, time moved at a different pace, measured not in headlines, but in small, incremental steps toward healing. Daniel slowly, haltingly began to come back to them. It started with the garden. One spring morning, Agnes looked out the kitchen window and saw him kneeling in the rich soil of the old Victory garden, his long, thin fingers crumbling a clod of dirt. He began to spend his days there, weeding, planting, and tending the shoots with a silent, single-minded focus. The work seemed to soothe him, the simple, life-affirming logic of the seasons a balm for his troubled mind. Then one afternoon, Michael, now a lanky teenager, was trying to build a birdhouse, his efforts clumsy and frustrating. Daniel watched him for a while from the back porch, and then, without a word, he got up, took the hammer and saw from his son's hands, and with a few swift, economical movements, showed him how to make a clean, straight cut. It was the first time Agnes had seen the old, confident carpenter reemerge, a flicker of the man he used to be. He never went back to carpentry as a trade, but he began to build things for the house. He started with the back porch he had promised Agnes so long ago, a beautiful, sturdy structure where they would sit on warm summer evenings. He built new shelves for her books, a dollhouse for Sarah that was a perfect replica of their own home. With each project, a little more of the emptiness in his eyes was filled. The laughter returned, not as often and not with the same window-rattling force, but it was there, a quiet, rumbling sound that was the most beautiful music Agnes had ever heard. He never spoke of the war. The jungle was a place he had visited in a nightmare, and he had no intention of ever returning, not even in words. Agnes learned to accept this. His healing was his own, and all she could do was provide the love and stability he needed to find his way. Her success was not measured in the new washing machine in the kitchen or the television in the living room. It was measured in the sound of her husband's quiet laughter, in the sight of her two children growing into smart, kind, and confident young adults, in the simple, profound peace of a family that had been broken and had, against all odds, do itself whole again. Her sacrifices, the years of worry, the backbreaking factory work, the patient, endless waiting, had not been for a grand victory but for this, the quiet, resilient, and unbreakable legacy of her family. One crisp, golden afternoon in the late 1950s, the kitchen was filled with a familiar, delicious warmth. Agnes stood at the counter, her hair now streaked with a graceful silver, her hands, though still capable, moving with a more deliberate pace. She was sifting flour into a large ceramic bowl, the same bowl she had used all those years ago. The world had changed. Sugar was no longer a rationed treasure, but a staple bought in 5-pound bags from the supermarket. Her children were grown. Michael was in college, studying to be an engineer, and Sarah was married to a good, steady young man and had a child of her own. A small, bright-eyed girl with Sarah's freckles and Daniel's smile toddled into the kitchen, drawn by the sweet smell. "What you mackin', Grandma?" she asked, her voice full of innocent curiosity. "I'm making a cake, little bird," Agnes said, the old pet name for her daughter now passed on to a new generation. "A very special cake." Her granddaughter Lucy watched with the same solemn intensity that Michael and Sarah had all those years ago, her eyes wide as Agnes creamed the butter and the plentiful sugar. As she worked, Agnes's gaze drifted to the kitchen windowsill. The small wooden bluebird still sat in its place of honor, its maple body glowing with the patina of age. It had been her constant companion through the darkest years, a silent symbol of a hope she had sometimes struggled to keep alive. Now it was simply a part of the kitchen, a beautiful reminder not of what she had endured, but of what she had built. Daniel came in from the backyard, his hands smudged with dirt from his beloved garden. He was older, quieter than the boy she had married, but the love in his eyes when he looked at her was as deep and steady as the oak tree in their yard. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Smells good, Aggie," he said softly, his voice a comfortable rumble against her ear. She leaned back against him, a lifetime of shared history and unspoken understanding passing between them in that simple touch. She looked around the warm, sunlit kitchen at her husband's loving embrace, at her granddaughter's hopeful face, at the small wooden bird that had weathered every storm with her. The memory of that cold winter morning in 1943, of the last of the sugar and the desperate, defiant act of baking that one precious cake, was as vivid as ever. But it no longer held the sharp sting of fear and scarcity. Instead, it had softened, transformed into a different kind of memory, a testament to the enduring power of a mother's love, a love that could take the last few grains of sweetness in a dark and bitter world and somehow miraculously make it enough. The cake in the oven was not a symbol of victory over a foreign enemy, but of a quieter, more profound triumph. The simple, beautiful, hard-won victory of a life well lived and a family well loved. The future, she thought, as she watched her granddaughter's small hand reach out to touch the wooden bird, was safe. It was, and always would be, built on a foundation of hope.